As I say, this is another Grab the Mic webinar from the Bhowmik Exchange. It's an opportunity for practitioners of market systems development in the field to present their work, their experiences, the lessons they've learned, and in general encourage knowledge exchange and sharing amongst the Bhowmik Exchange community, people who work in market systems development. Now, today we are very lucky to have the team responsible for the M4C program in Bangladesh speaking. I have a personal interest in this program because I was involved quite heavily in the original design of the program, and so I'm very keen to hear how the experience of implementing it has been. Maybe they will have some lessons for me in particular about some of the things we wrote into the design. So without much further ado then, can I introduce you to Mahmoud, Jannat, Zinia and Anirban from Swisscontact. Who's going to speak first? I think it's going to be Mahmoud, isn't it?
Yes, I am.
Very happy to hand the mic over to you, and please introduce yourself to everybody.
Yeah, thank you, Mike. I am S.M. Mahmuduzzaman, working as the team leader of M4C project. M4C is the short form. The full name of the project is Making Market Work for the Jamuna, Padda and Tista Chor. Though we will use the M4C form throughout the presentation. I would like to thank Bhowmik Exchange for arranging this and having us to present on our project. Let's go straight to the country level data. Bangladesh has been mentioned as the third fastest growing economy of the world this year by PricewaterhouseCoopers. And this development is not only a sudden development, there is a gradual trend. As we can see, the poverty rate has gone down from 40% to 23%, almost halved in last 10 years. And in the similar time frame, we can see that the per capita income has increased from slightly over $600 to $1,500, almost 3 times. However, this development is not spread all over the country equally. We can see this, there are pockets of poverty, and one such pocket of poverty is the Chor regions of Bangladesh. You can see in the map where we are working, and the Chor is actually a local term used to identify the island that has grown, developed in the rivers over time of 2, 3, or 4 decades, and people started inhabiting these places. And now we are showing in the screen the places we are working, and I think Mike will be able to identify more these places. You can always see that presence of river by the area where we are working. So there are 10 districts that we started our work with, and in this phase we are working in 3 out of those 10 districts. Here we'll show in the map the districts where we are working. The pin, we have marked the places with pin. The green ones are the ones where currently the work is going on. And this map, if you can follow closely, we will see that these are by the rivers, and this is a flood map of Bangladesh, and the sky blue color shows that there is a high intensity. So where we are working, these areas are highly flood prone, and with flood comes other types of problems like erosion of land, loss of asset. And these chores are not only spread in the northern region, it's spread all over the countries. We have selected few of the places to work with. And you can easily understand the chore dwellers' life is of struggle. As you have already mentioned, that flood, erosion, and the associated risk they feel, and the economy is fragile, so economic activities very less. People do not find livelihood options all the time. In one year, typical year, individual in the chor will work as a day laborer, as a farmer, and even as a migrating worker in urban centers nearby. And as the chor land, you have, I have mentioned earlier that it's an island on the river, so it's geographically isolated. There is no road connection directly, making travel very cumbersome for the chor dwellers. The one-way trip, if someone wants to go to the nearest urban center, it takes 3 to 4 hours, and these trips are also costly. And alongside the chor dwellers, it makes life tough for the implementers as well, and also for the private company persons who want to, salesperson who want to visit the chors. So this is one critical difficulty that chor dwellers and as well as the practitioners, as practitioners we face. And being isolated, these places are also deprived of the changes and awareness campaigns that goes through all over the country. For example, gender issues, the issues of child health, child mortality, and so on are very much absent. And as a result, women's movement is highly restricted. They are usually confined within their home state, and early child marriage is very frequent. So in a nutshell, this is a very struggling life. If we talk on the voice of Warren Buffett, as he frequently mentions, being born in USA is winning a lottery, and being born in a chor is losing the lottery like hell. But considering that 2 million people living in the northern regions of the chor only, we cannot let them live like this for longer and speak that Bangladesh has achieved balanced growth, balanced development. For that reason, M4C actually from 2012 started working in these areas, and M4C has been funded by Swiss Agency for Development and Cooperation, SDC, and fortunately we have the focal person of SDC with us, Dr. Syeda Zinia Rashid amongst us, and I would at this stage invite her to speak about the idea behind this project as well as the SDC's views in Bangladesh. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Zinia Rashid.
Thank you, Mahmoud bhai. Hello, everyone. I'm Zinia from SDC part, and I think this is a wonderful opportunity for every one of us to talk about the learning out of this M4C project implementation. And here I'm very much thankful to the Bhowmik Exchange to organize that, and overall to the M4C team that they have designed such webinar based on our recent social impact studies in the field. So today, very briefly, here I would like to briefly bring up on the perspective of SDC as a donor, and also SDC as a long-standing development partner of Bangladesh historically, and what about the mandate and the core interest to particularly implement this M4C project. First, I would like to start with the strategic complementation of SDC, which was by applying the MSD market system development approach in the chor areas, where the asset-based large livelihood support program, CLP, Chor's Livelihoods Program, which was funded by DFID, and that program really could graduate the extreme poor household during the program implementation time, and they could really involve them, the chor people, in increased economic activities and opportunities as well. CLP actually worked in 2 phases, and starting from 2004 and ended in the middle of 2016, while SDC actually launched the M4C project during late 2011. And it was from SDC part, it was all about bringing the experiences and know-how which was gathered by the SDC financed flagship project Samriddhi for a long time, and the very famous joint DFID SDC flagship project Catalyst. So in TLP, the key livelihood input was in the form of asset transfer was mainly livestock. So therefore, in that program, the market development approach in agriculture sector was unexplored. But in addition to that, of course, the continuous challenge for our government as well to really expand the extension activities and services with our limited resources to those store areas, and this is always a continuous challenge as a nation. So therefore, from SDC part, the design of M4C was really not focusing on targeted household on the chore. Rather, the strategic approach was facilitation in the market systemic areas, and which are importantly the input side, output, and the finance most important. So also M4C, the core strategic focus was also the capacity development of the chore farmers and the market actors, and thereby M4C really wanted to create greater access to the services. So in this way, the whole strategic complementation of this project was for a long-term sustainable development through the market-based solutions instead of a short and quicker solution on the jobs. I would now talk about the second rationale for SDC, which is the institutional mandate for poverty reduction and through the social changes activities. And for that, the core strategies are inclusion and reaching to the hard-to-reach areas. So the technical arrangement of M4C project is valued within SDC as a solid initiative, and it targets the poorest and the most disadvantaged people living in the extremely hard-to-reach chore areas. And this is fully aligned with SDC's core mandate to work for the vulnerable and poor people, and particularly women residing on the chore, in order to reduce the poverty ultimately. So integration of women also in this way in the service sector or business models of private and public sectors actually enhances the access of chore women, particularly to the specific knowledge improvement, their skills development, and also information-wise. So the whole M4C strategy was based on the DRR approach, and it has a continuous focus on increasing resilience of chore dwellers, and this is solely achieved by strengthening the delivery of the input in a very time-efficient manner and services as well, and at the same time the improved knowledge of those market actors and transferring the risk mitigation techniques to tackle the changes that could create by several types of disasters. The last and the third important aspect I would conclude here with the flexibility in managing the implementation of this project by SDC. So design-wise, M4C technically adapted with the dynamic chore market reality. The phase 1 while began with the cross-sector approach in several sectors like maize, chili, jute, etc., with larger outreach, and we had interested potential partners. And at the same time, the continuous action research actually complemented by the public agency, and in total they improved the quality of the intervention in the field. And that altogether provided ample confidence to the relevant stakeholders in order to gradually expand their businesses. While in phase 2, the project actually regrouped its intervention under the selected systemic change areas of the market and covered both crop and livestock sectors since CLP was over by that time. And the third area is the partnership of this flexibility. So the partnership approach with the market actor, here also SDC's core objective was to learn, to innovate, and to adapt. And therefore, as a result, M4C has developed or proved the business strategy of the commercial companies generating as more inclusive while they are targeting now the chore market as well. So this is also another important objective from SDC side, that the service providers are now becoming more inclusive in terms of their business offer. With this, I think I would like to hand over to Mahmoud Bhai for the next presentation. Over to you.
Thank you, Zinia. Indeed, it was beneficial to know about SDC's view in Bangladesh and as well as the background of the M4C project. Let's get back to the drawing board. Here is the theory of change. And the lower half, if you look at, it is similar to any other market system development project. However, on the upper portion, we have assumed that the enhanced performance of the household will increase their income, and that will reduce the vulnerability and increase the well-being of the households. And that's where actually today's presentation will focus a little bit more, because that's where we did a lot of brainstorming and work. And also we expect the third eye view and also ideas from the audience as well. As I have already said, the project has done a tremendous job, and the learning and the experience of the chore is very vast, and that can itself be a content of another presentation. However, for the interest of better utilization of time, we will focus on three specific issues and talk on that. First of all is the how the intervention contributed to the transition of the individuals in shoreland, and then the transition, how the transition has contributed to the vulnerability reduction, and finally the framework that we have used to measure vulnerability. So going forward, we have worked with the input providers, the output service providers, and financial institutions. In the input section, we actually introduced the household with linked the household with the good quality input providers, and also provided knowledge of cultivation through these channels. And side by side, once the productivity increases and production improves, that will create market glut if the linkage with the buyers are not done. So on that front, we have worked with large maize buyers, and those are the poultry feed mills, and also with national level companies like Pran, who sells spices and buy a large amount of chili. And also on the other front, we work with financial institutions, to be specific, the microfinance institutes, so that once the knowledge is there, if the chore dwellers want to expand their area of cultivation or wants to diversify their livelihood by investing in livestock as well, they can find an option. So all three actors performed very well, and we have achieved a very good result. I would say we have benefited more than 500,000 individuals in the chore from more than 100,000 households, and the additional income that they have achieved is more than $16 billion over last 6 years. And this achievement is commendable by any standard, I would say, and we have been appreciated for that as well. However, the question that remains to be addressed is that what is the relationship of the income increase with the vulnerability reduction? This is where we put a lot of brainstorming. We designed meticulously the framework to measurement and collected data using the framework, and the result, finally we have got the result. And to take you to that part of the story, my colleague Jannat Adib Chowdhury will join in and take the presentation from here forward. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Here is Jannat Adib Chowdhury.
Thank you, Mahmuduzzaman. Picking up where Mahmuduzzaman basically left off, so basically from our projects, and we were sure that income increase is happening, but we were uncertain whether that income increase is resulting in vulnerability reduction or not. And for that matter, we tried to dig deep. We tried to did a internal document revision. We looked into other knowledge resources that explains very well in terms of vulnerability and other aspects. And we saw that we can actually merge basically vulnerable defeat sustainable livelihood framework. We can basically merge amortization capability approach. We can also merge M4C's systemic change framework. So combining these three, we developed market system changes for sustainable vulnerability reduction framework. So as you can see in the slide, that vulnerability context has popped up, and in this context, we basically figured that out. So chore dwellers, they basically have two type of livelihood options and livelihood capital. So livelihood options, and since the chore economy is very agrarian in nature, our data suggests that only 6% of the population they're not involved in agricultural activities. So most of these chore dwellers are involved either in crops, livestock, or labor as livelihood options. And in terms of livelihood capital, we basically saw that there are basically 5 capitals: human, natural, physical, financial, and social capital. So all these capitals basically lead to formation, determines whether the chore dwellers have they're adding on to their capital base or not, and that determines the extent of the vulnerability. And you can see in the diagram that we have for the framework, the left side of the diagram basically shows the market system actors, the input and output actors, and finance actors, through which we basically tried to give better product, better information, and better linkage. And by doing that, all these actors were basically trying to give better offerings to these chore dwellers. And these chore dwellers, in turn, were taking up different set of livelihood strategy, meaning intensification, extensification, and diversification. And all this strategy was resulting into better capability and better performance for them. And also, we sort of saw that if livelihood outcome was getting better, it means that the income that they were generating from livelihood outcome may lead back to livelihood capital formation. And also at the right side of the diagram, you see there are 4 systemic change elements that we got from the systemic change framework of M4C's. And we sort of thought that if there is change in or transformation in each of these elements, this would imply that the system would continue to offer different set of services to these vulnerable group of people, and they will spontaneously get themselves involved in the context. So this is, in a nutshell, the framework, and we sort of looked into our existing information, and we saw that we basically have income increase data, but we don't have any assessment on vulnerability or systemic change. So we merged these two, and we did a very, very time-extensive, time-consuming study. You can see from the slide there are basically 3 distinct phases through which this study was done. The most interesting part of this study is the phase 1, where we had a team of anthropology professors with their group of ethnographers who basically lived in 4 selected chores in our target districts, and they basically immersed themselves within that area, and they basically developed different indicators of livelihood capital enhancement and market system changes. So this was pretty intense in nature. And after this microethnographic study was done, we basically had to check the indicators with a much larger sample size, and we did the phase 2 by gathering information on 230 households. And the last phase is about systemic change assessment, which was predominantly qualitative in nature, and we gathered information through focus group discussions and key informant interviews. So now that you sort of have a clear understanding, I suppose, on the assessment type, let's look at the interesting findings that we drew from the study. And you can see there's two flower-shaped diagram in the slide, and you see the right side of the diagram basically showcases that the income that was being generated from farming was actually being like looped back into different capital. So, for example, if I talk about physical capital, the sort of housing materials that the shore dwellers were using previously was, say, for example, these were very fragile in nature. For example, this was mud-based or bamboo-based. But now, with increased income, they have shifted into much better quality housing materials, and they live in houses made with tin or even, in some cases, brick-lane houses. We also saw that the shore dwellers who themselves never got educational opportunities in their childhood, or some of these shore dwellers, even most of them, the women, they got married by the age of 12 or 14. They, with the increased income from livestock or maize farming, they're sending their sons or daughters to school. So there is there is capital formation even at the human capital end. So we have stories and evidences for each of these capital formation, and also at the holistic level, we see that there is major changes in the investment climate of chore. We see that, for example, you see that the overall agro-input market has really expanded, or there is microfinance institutions who has flocked into chores. Now, this basically showcases the holistic capital pentagon of chore, and gives a very comparative picture. So prior to M4C's intervention, what we see is that the capital pentagon is imbalanced in nature. And this is interesting because the more imbalanced the pentagon is, it showcases that the access to each of this capital is not very balanced in nature, or people lack in some degree. So, for example, prior to M4C's intervention, human and natural capital was much higher, meaning there was much like abundance of labor and land, but social, physical, and financial capital was much smaller in nature. But after M4C's intervention, we see that the pentagon has morphed into a more balanced shape. So that really tells that the access to capital is being generated, and which implies that vulnerability reduction is happening, and the coping mechanism of these shore dwellers are getting better with time. Now that we have looked into the vulnerability reduction aspect of the assessment, let's look at the findings that we gathered from the systemic change assessment. And you see that there are 4 elements that we had basically developed from the systemic change framework of M4C's. So in each of these elements, perception, attitude, investment, crowding in, trust, relationship, innovation, we saw that there is great changes happening. There was strong evidence that things are shifting. So we have time limitations today. I would just explain the shift that we have observed in terms of perception and attitude of market system actors. So here in this slide, you can see that there is a before-after scenario of the way market system actors are treating each other in different strata of relationship. For example, Previously, input companies were perceiving chores to be loss-making, but now they're actively exploring opportunities for expansion. If you look at the local engineering workshops, they previously were not focusing in chores, and didn't even give the thought of assembling machineries with chore market in mind. But now they're increasingly putting in money for assembling machines within for that region. In this slide, you can see it's a snapshot of the way market system actors have had a boom in the region in just a span of 6 years. You can see that input retailers back in 2012 were only 72 in number, but now in 2018 there are more than 500 retailers working. So we see that there is massive boom in terms of market system actors numbers, and that obviously means that there is a lot of economic growth that is happening within chore market system, and means that they're incentivized enough to consider that chore dwellers are business worthy, investment worthy, and they will continue to give offerings to of better products and services to these chore dwellers, and meaning that the chore dwellers will also participate spontaneously in the market system. And that brings us to the last slide of the presentation. And we have had obviously gathered a lot of lessons, but we feel that for today's presentation, we think that there are 2 lessons for you to keep in mind, that if you're designing projects for a very vulnerable group of people, we think that our work with market system development approach in chore, it really challenged the conventional notion that this sort of vulnerable group of people can not only be like recipients of assets and technical transfer, but they can't be proactive agents of change. But we see that with changes induced by the market system, they themselves can be economically self-reliant. And we also see that rigidity to market system principles should be avoided if you're applying market system development principles in the region in context like this, because in thin market context, flexibility is important. M4C didn't only work in input, output, or finance. We also worked in addressing contextual vulnerability to address issues such as transportation. So that brings us to the end of the question. Please post us questions. We're looking forward to your questions. Thank you.
Jannat, thank you very much, and Mahmoud, thank you very much for your presentation, and Zinia for setting the scene for us with STC's strategy in Bangladesh. I'm sure there's going to be some questions from the audience here. You can post your questions in the chat box, which is down in the bottom right-hand corner of the WebEx dashboard. And if you post them there to everyone, everyone will be able to see the questions that are being raised. While that's happening, while you're thinking of questions you'd like to ask the speakers, I have a question in advance that came from someone who registered for the event. So the question was for you, Mahmoud. The question is how you feel the level of participation by local private sector actors has been in the chores with the program since it started in 2011. How satisfactory has the crowding in of private sector players been?
Yeah, thank you, Mike. Actually, the work in the chore context is not as straightforward as bringing the private sector actors and introduce them to the beneficiaries or the chore dwellers. The context requires that there should be a set of intermediary actors that link between the grassroots level producers to the big companies. For the big companies, directly involving in the chore is costly, because as you have seen, the isolation of the piece of land and the transport, limited transport means, and these actually give them, I mean, these just actually discourage them to directly get involved with that. So in this case, we have developed, worked with the local people and developed a set of local entrepreneurs or micro entrepreneurs who actually performed, bridged the gap between the chore dwellers and the big companies. These are like the, you can say, the traders who collect the goods from the farmer and provide it to the big feed mills, and then there are retailers who actually work as a shadow distributor for the big companies who wants to sell quality inputs in the chore lands. And in that context, the last slide that Jannat has shown in her presentation, that there is a big boom in the presence of these local level market actors. And so we are happy with the change, and we feel that it is a very successful bridging that has taken place between big companies and the chore dwellers in terms of connectivity. So yes, we are happy with the level of growth in these entrepreneurs in the middle ground.
Can you thank you, Mahmoud? Can you? So there's a question to follow up on that from Kabir. Sorry, I just lost the name there. From Kabir Lawal. Said, what was the? Could you be more specific about the exact offer that was provided by M4C to input suppliers that convinced them to get more engaged with the markets on the chores? How did they go about then distributing their products? And how the higher costs of that, given the high costs of reaching the chores, how was that cost absorbed by the customers? So it's three questions really. But
can I respond to that?
Yes, please.
Okay. Just to kind of provide everybody with another additional information on the context, one of the major reasons why the large private input companies were not expanding their business into chores is basically they were completely unaware of the business potential of the chores. So the perceived notion about chore was it is a barren land. People live hand to mouth, and people are basically dependent entirely on transfers. So for us, one of the major challenge of convincing private input companies to expand their business was to convince them with the business potential. So our first step was to do a thorough market research, which traditionally is expected to be a core business operation or strategic objective action done by a private company. But this time we had to do that market research and convince people that, okay, there is a market waiting for you. That was one of the ways of convincing private companies. Then our next offer was, if there is a market, why then are they not expanding? And the high transaction cost was identified as a major cost for not going there. So we started to structure a deal where we initially started to offer to take up quite a lot of risks, because this is an uncertain territory. The cost of operation was pretty high. However, our main objective really was to prove the business case. And once we could see that the companies are having greater sales from the market, they started to pick up the cost. And that's where we renegotiated quite a lot of our costs. And towards the beginning of phase 2, we realized that the activities that we are doing now needs to be mainstreamed, and it needs to become part of the company's core strategy. So as a result, we started to engage with them at a much more strategic level and see how they can generate more sales, what it would take to generate more sales from the chores, and started to structure our technical assistance offer, keeping that sales as a target in mind, and mainstream it into the proper sales strategy of each company. And then the third element in this whole process really was to focus on establishing the distribution channel, because chores are pretty disconnected, remotely located, so there is hardly any presence of last mile distribution. And that was one of the major reasons why the farmers or people living on the chores were not using quality seed. Because if you travel 2 hours to get 1 kg of seeds, that transportation cost adds to your to one's seat cost, and that makes it even more expensive for them. So the affordability gets affected. So as a result, we also focused on creating the last mile distribution, and that's where Mahmud's point of creating micro entrepreneurs becomes important. So we basically the check initially was a blank check to prove that it is possible to do business in the chores, even though it is riskier, even though it would take longer time to prove the business model, and it would take longer handholding, maybe much more intensive support than an usual market system development project would offer. But this was done to customize to the challenging context operating environment.
Okay, thank you very much. We have lots of questions coming in. I'm struggling to decide on priorities, but I've got one more question about the implementation work, and then I'm going to ask a question about gender and vulnerability. But just before I come on to the gender question, which I know lots of you are interested in, can you just tell us a little bit more about the access to finance aspects of M4C's work? This is a critical blockage for CLP, according to Matt Pritchard, who's asked this question, and I'm wondering how what changes and improvements have happened since sort of mid-2016 when CLP finished.
Thank you, Mike. Yeah, for access to finance, the problem was similar to the big companies, that they were not seeing this segment as a very viable one. And for the Microfinance Institute, the transaction cost is the same like private companies. It is higher, and for them the additional problem was that these people are actually never tested before in terms of microcredit, and they wouldn't be able to repay loan as with the start of the handover of the loan. As you might know that the installment begins with the disbursement as well. So at the same time, every week the people taking loan needs to repay. So in the chore, for the chore people to repay the loan right after having the disbursement is a very difficult task. And for that, our suggestion to the Microfinance Institute was that the loan has some grace period, and when the farmer harvests their product, only then the repayment should be scheduled. And this was not very much palatable offer for the Microfinance Institute. However, like the private companies work, we actually took a bit of their cost in terms of reaching to the target group, so that they can recover, they can get part of their cost recovered from there, and then tested this model of seasonal loan. The loan is given at the beginning of the season, and the repayment is done at the end of it. So first batch of microcredit providers was not so sure about it, but agreed to start it in the chore land. And then once the first season has completed, all of them got 100% recovery rate. And that was very much encouraging for us, and also surprising for the Microfinance Institutes, that this fragile piece of land dwellers gave the loan back, repaid the loan back. And from there, there is no returning point. All the microcredit organizations have increased their number of branches, and also the outstanding loan amount has increased since then.
Mike, just to add one thing in terms of finance-related intervention, the sequencing was also quite important, because we did not start from the very beginning with access to finance intervention. We initially focused on better utilization of the available resources they had, and once they moved up a bit in terms of the commercial orientation of the agriculture, when they realized that the initial capital formation had happened, then we started to work with the microfinance institutions to introduce a new product which matches well with the cash flow cycle of the chor farmers. So that was particularly challenging because this was a new product which we had to customize and convince microfinance institutions to introduce. And that's where we also offered a sort of a credit guarantee risk to some extent, partial credit guarantee risk to microfinance institutions as a form of risk sharing modality.
Okay, very interesting. Thank you. So look, I'm going to rushing on, and excuse me for chopping and changing the topic, but we've had a couple of questions about gender dynamics from Ariola Singh Jerji and John Chettleborough, and I'm wondering, can you tell us about how women and men experience vulnerability differently on the chores, and do you have any evidence that specifically looked at the impact of M4C's interventions on women differently from men?
Thank you, Mike, for the question. I'll be responding to that. I'm Jannat. So in terms of the question whether men and women living the chores have different experience in terms of vulnerability, we see that that is very true. The chore men, they naturally have to migrate to different locations because there were limited livelihood options. So during certain part of the year, they would move out of their territory and look for different type of jobs. And so men living the chores, they have to deal with that sort of vulnerability. They will have to be constantly be on the move and see whether there is scope for income generation. Whereas women, on the other hand, as you know, Bangladesh is has very conservative outlook towards female, and mobility of women is usually restricted, especially in areas like chore. So women, they usually have to stay within the chore region, and considering there is not other public support such as schools or other set of host of facilities for them to reach their potential. Usually we see that women get really married at a tender age. We have seen that women, there were kids getting married at the age of 10 or 12, and right after marriage, they themselves were giving birth. So they really experience vulnerabilities from two angles. But then again, all these females, they also have to deal with when their husband or the male counterpart is not present in the household. So they'll have to deal with a lot of other additional responsibilities while their male counterpart is away. And while doing our interventions, we sort of try to see that inherently, even though female were not usually targeted by input companies, because even the market system actors, they are mostly male, and male usually work in the farm lands, even as the mainland. But due to the interesting dynamics of the chore, where male counterparts are moving out of the chores, these females, they take a much bigger role in terms of taking up this farming responsibilities. So we actually sort of saw that that is leading to even being more women empowerment at the chore female level. They were becoming more like they had better understanding of agricultural practices. They were trading with traders, because with the expansion in commercial agriculture, we sort of facilitated traders to come in and get produce from the farm gate. So these females, they started sort of behaving as a very micro-level entrepreneur on their own. And we also did other interventions focusing on livestock and finance, microfinance, where females were taking a much bigger role as opposed to the male counterparts. That's it from my end.
Well, thank you very much for that question. Now we have about 10 minutes left, and I know somebody has already this question in the chat box, and I really have it too, which is, I think would be very interested to understand your final lesson, your final point on the final slide, where you talked about the rigidity of market system principles and how to avoid it. Could you discuss a little bit more about what you understand that flexibility with regard to market systems development principles to be, and give us sort of some practical examples?
Okay, maybe I'll start and then others can chip in as they deem necessary. So first of all, just to give you a very specific example, when we started implementing M4C, there was a big concern whether there is enough produce which can be aggregated and which would be attractive for private sector to come in. That's one. Then the second question related to that was whether there is enough buyer, aggregated buyer, whether the demand is large enough. We started with producers group. We started forming producers group directly, which often is considered as a big no-no in a standard MSD approach. But we thought that we will have to do that at the very beginning, because the whole objective is to prove the business case to the private sector companies, and we invested in doing that. And even though we had a big debate amongst ourselves whether we should continue to do that or not, but we felt, when we reflect, that was a critical task that we had done. Otherwise, we could not have proven the business case to the private sector. We stopped doing that forming of private sector producer group after a certain point in time, because we felt market is ready. There is enough knowledge and enough awareness about quality input. We stopped doing that. So one of the key learning here is often things may not look like a market systems approach and may look more hands-on, but we had to do this because we had to respond to the contextual difficulty. But the big learning in this whole process is knowing when to come out of it. So even though we were doing quite a hands-on implementation on the ground, but we knew when we would come out. We always had our exit strategy in mind. So having that perspective helps. Now the second question, second specific example, I will go back to the initial example that I have given in terms of market research. In a very traditional market systems approach, we probably would expect private sector to do a lot of market research because that's their core mandate. That is pretty close to their core business strategy. But in the chore context, where there is lack of information and nobody has any idea about how fluid that, how big that market is, what are the composition of that market, what are the key characteristics of that market segment, it was very difficult to convince private sector even to look at the chores. So from that perspective, we had to invest a lot of our own resources in market research, in collecting those information, because we thought this information would be important to convince private sector about the about the investability in the chores. So that's another example where we have done things differently, which traditionally market systems project would not do. In Catalyst, we have not done that. We expected private sector to do that, but when it came to M4C, we had to pick up that. Again, another example is the cost sharing, where we had to share greater cost. We had to share cost for a longer period of time, and the reduction of our offer took much longer than it had taken in other mainland related interventions.
Yeah. Also, I would like to add with that setting up the distribution channel is actually the responsibility of the private sector themselves, but in this case we have helped them to do that, and that is also deviation from the purest market system approach. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Probably just time for one chunky question, and I'm going to choose a difficult one if you don't mind at the end. You started your presentation, Mahmoud, by pointing out that Bangladesh has been experiencing very strong economic growth in general, but that there's a real issue about communities that are being left behind. And that's why, in a sense, the rationale for M4C is about protecting and supporting the most vulnerable. Helen Helen S has asked whether the program has sort of looked at the coping strategies that vulnerable groups use, which often traditionally rely on, social networks, white family networks, and so on. And is there a risk that this social capital is actually undermined by the focus on more sort of entrepreneurial and market-orientated individualistic behaviour in households that the M4C program has been encouraging? So in other words, does the M4C strategy itself somehow possible for such systems to support the most vulnerable people?
I'll start, Mike. Basically, it is actually the contrary, because what we are seeing is it is helping formation of social capital, and it is changing the relationship between most vulnerable living in the chores with its surrounding. For example, if we look at the most vulnerable people living in the chores, there is a huge amount of dependency on the landowners. It's a very sort of patriarchal society where the landowners control a lot of and creates a lot of dependency. And the social capital is almost absent because people often are not invited into events, they're not recognized, and they're not supported by the communities, which is quite different from the mainland. The social cohesion is often quite weak. But what we are seeing now, since people are accumulating wealth, they're challenging the status quo, and the dependency on the traditional landowners are decreasing. And what we are seeing now is with the newfound capital, they're also getting lots of recognition. The political elites are also now approaching them and considering them as a viable, as a kind of important stakeholder where they need to engage with them, they need to listen to them. And we have conducted a bit of political economy study to understand how M4C's intervention has influenced the power structure and the relationship. And the indication that we have now is we are seeing that people are getting more empowered because people now have got better choice, access to better information, and they can decide where to get their input from, where to get their finance, and that has contributed to greater social cohesion at beneficiary level. But it has obviously challenged the traditional social capital, which was a sort of a dependency structure between the local elites and the people living on the shores. But it clearly was an unintended impact. Whether we really wanted and had a social intervention, no, but we are clearly seeing that the economic interventions are having a social impact.
Well, thank you very much, Anirban. That's a great response to end the webinar on. I'm very sorry to say that we've run out of time, and I can see in the chat box a whole range of really interesting questions that have not been answered. So I will encourage, after this webinar is finished, I will encourage the speakers to take these questions into the Beam forum on LinkedIn, which is our text-based, and I hope we can continue conversations. In the meantime, I have a couple of really important requests for you. First of all, please take a look at the link that's just been posted in the chat box to our feedback survey. We really desperately wish to hear from you about what you thought about the webinar, how effective it was for you, how we can improve these webinars. So click on that link or copy that link into your browser and quickly fill out our 2-minute survey, and I'll be hugely grateful for that. And the other link that you can see in the chat box at the bottom now is, as I said, it's the link to our Beam forum on LinkedIn, and you'll be able to hopefully continue some of these, well, just chuck these questions into there, post these questions there, and I will encourage the speakers to go to LinkedIn and respond to some of these really interesting questions that you've raised. Otherwise, all I have to do really is thank the speakers for a really interesting webinar. As I said, I had a personal interest and investment in this program, having been involved in its design, so it's very rewarding to hear about the results and to find out that some really interesting work has been done, and some very important lessons have been learned, which hopefully the wider microsystems development community can use. But yes, so thanks very much. Any last words from the speakers?
Yes, we are very much encouraged with the participation from around the world. The number of questions proves the interest level, and definitely we will try to respond to the questions in the LinkedIn group. I would like to thank Beam Exchange again for arranging this webinar. This was very much good experience for us, and the questions actually gave us new ways of thinking, and also gave us new thoughts about the project. I would also like to thank Zinia for being part of this webinar, and surely her input were very much valuable here. And with that, we'd like to say goodbye to all of you.
Okay. Well, goodbye to you too, and thanks very much again. And I hope you'll all come and join us for our next webinar.